You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Autumn Burt and Jesper Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Jesper. This is episode 57 of the AmWritingFantasy podcast. And today, Autumn is not here, so I'm joined by an awesome guest, and that is Sacha Black. So Sascha is a fantasy author, she's an editor, and the host of the Rebel Author podcast. So Sascha has written several guides on and workbooks on how to write compelling heroes and villains. So we're going to learn from her great insight on this topic here today. But first, welcome to the AmWritingFantasy podcast, Sascha.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it was very nice to talk to you. And as I just said there, I know that you're also the host of the Rebel Author podcast. But what's that podcast about?
I am. So the Rebel Author podcast is a motivational show for creatives who like to break the rules or rebel against, conventions, or just people who have the dry, sarcastic wit, who like, the occasional naughty word. But it is essentially about writing, publishing, marketing, all of those industry type topics. And I tend to do interviews as well. Occasionally I do a solo show, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So is it specifically focused on just any creative outlet, like any genre for writers, or are you focused on like certain elements within it, or?
No, so it is for any writer of any genre. So I write, obviously, as you've said, I write nonfiction and young adult fantasy, kind of moving into adult fantasy soon. So I try to keep the topics wide. So, about the craft as a whole, rather than something very niche to, historical fiction. Also occasionally, or I will be having anyway, topics that, interviews that are more general to creatives. So it might be, about a mindset or business, which could be any creative business. So yeah, I do try to keep it quite broad for all creatives.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. It's interesting because we sort of went the other way by, right? I mean, of course, the topics that we are handling or talking about on this podcast, some of it is generic, like marketing and publishing and stuff like that. But at least from the writing perspective, we've sort of niched down and focused on fantasy writing. So it's quite nice to hear that you also write fantasy.
Yeah, well, I actually think it's really important to be niche, because I think you serve your audience much better when you do that. And I suppose the thing that's overarching on my podcast, rather than it being necessarily the niche topic, it's more the niche ethos and theme. So I always ask all of my guests to tell us about a time that they've been a rebel. And every week I will read out a listener who's a rebel, and a little story that they've sent in, and
cool.
I am sarcastic and witty. Well, witty, that's for listeners to decide, but I hope I'm funny anyway. But I will intersperse some naughty made up swear words or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of the feeling of the podcast that is niche. I will not appeal to everybody because I have a potty mouth. I'm opinionated. But I'm okay with that because I think that helps you find your audience essentially.
No, I fully agree. I think it's better to be a bit, let's say, unique, and then some people will like it, and some people won't, and that's absolutely fine. I think that's better than trying to appeal to everyone.
Definitely, that's how you find your tribe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, how did you get into writing fantasy? Did you always know that you wanted to write fantasy?
Oh, that is such a good question. I don't think so. I am like the least self-aware person ever. So I didn't really know that I wanted to write until I was in my mid-20s. I think if I had been more self-aware, I would have realised, because all the signs were there. You know, I was that kid who'd prefer to read in the library at lunch rather than go and play with other people, you know, things like this. But in terms of fantasy specifically, as a teenager, I read a lot of fantasy. I also, interestingly, read a lot of crime. And a lot of romance. So I don't think I necessarily knew that that's what I wanted to write until I really got into writing. And a lot of my fears around writing came from not knowing, you know, if I was going to make some kind of accuracy error. So if you write fantasy, you can make a lot of it up. So I ended up creating a fantasy world, and it's actually just the first character that came to me. So my first book has been with me since I was like 9 years old. I always knew this character. So I'm not going to stick with fantasy forever. I definitely have a contemporary young adult book that I'm about to work on this year that has, I guess, hints of magical realism in it, but it is predominantly set in the real world. So no, I don't. I read a lot of fantasy now, but I also read a lot of contemporary. I read a lot of nonfiction. So I don't know. I just like it. So there is no rhyme or reason behind it particularly.
No, now that you called it self-aware, then I didn't know that I was that unself-aware, but apparently I am, because it wasn't until I was like, 38 or something that I figured out that I wanted to write. So apparently I'm less self-aware than you are.
Well, you know, lots of us are told when we grow up to get a proper job. And, you know, I thought a proper job meant going to university and being on one of these really super dull management fast track graduate things, you know. So it took me a while to realize that I really hated the corporate world.
Right. But one thing I did find out by, snoozing around on the internet was that you quite like conspiracy theories. So I thought that was quite fun. So I wanted to ask you if you have like a favorite conspiracy theory.
That's so hard. So mean of you to ask me that, because there's so many. I do like them because for two reasons. One, I derive a lot of inspiration from them. You know, they are quite dystopian when you look at them. And I love dystopian stories. I definitely will be writing a dystopian series at some point. But you can also take elements of fantasy from them. So, you know, like Flat Earth, for example, is a great example of a conspiracy that's wildly popular at the moment. And there are so many elements to that, you know, things like giants and whether the gods were actually aliens. You know, all of these things actually play really well into fiction, particularly science fiction and fantasy. So that is why I love them. And so Hollow Earth is another one, Hollow Moon, the firmament and having a dome over the earth. There are just millions that I will read about and will take elements of to put into my stories. The other reason I like them relates to villains. And I always think one of the good markers of a villain is when they're crazy or they're, what's the word? Like whatever they're trying to. So like President Snow wants the Hunger Games in the Hunger Games. He wants the reality TV show. When they are so convincing that they can get you to believe in their crazy for just a second, I always think that's a really good mark of a villain. And I think that some of these conspiracy theories, when you look at some of the, you know, really ardent supporters and some of their arguments, you can, for a split second or two, actually, you know, really invest in them and believe in them. And I always think that when it's that convincing, you can learn things from that for your fiction.
Yeah, that is funny, because that's exactly why I like conspiracy theories as well, because there's so much inspiration in some of it. It's just like, well, some of it is like really out there, you know, but it's still that there's a lot of good ideas that you can use for storytelling in there. And I quite like the one where they're talking about that, that the matrix, that we're actually living in a matrix-like thing. So the whole thing, the entire world is just simulation. I quite like that one.
But there are scientific books on the universe as a hologram. There are like genuinely traditionally published books. I had one a few years ago, and I can't remember the exact name, but it was something like the universe is a hologram. Anyway, yeah, fascinating. And that is also what I love, that some of these things really do venture into the science of it. And that's when it becomes extremely hard to ignore. And, you do find yourself questioning, well, have I been lied to? What is the government really? All of these things. But yeah, I think that having an open mind and investigating these things, be it conspiracy theories or science or, some detailed avenue as a writer is really important, because we do filter all of the things that we put into our brain back out into our fiction, and I just think it gives us more depth to our stories.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and now I can't remember which one it was, which of course then makes it a bad example to bring up, but I did listen to a podcast like a couple of months ago where they were talking about numbers and how if you add this to this and there was something about the moon as well, the actual size of the moon and something like that, and everything just keeps adding up to the same numbers or something. It was insane listening to, but anyway, that's a rabbit hole that we can get down into another day. But we wanted to talk a bit about compelling heroes and villains today, so I don't know, maybe I could just start out by asking you what it is that you think makes for a compelling hero and villain. So overall, maybe for a start.
Yeah, so a villain. Interestingly, a lot of the same things cross over, and between what makes a good hero and what makes a good villain. But what often happens is that writers focus all their attention on their hero, because obviously the hero is the person who the story is being told via, and therefore they have the most page time. But the mistake that you're making there is that all stories are about change, be it the emotional arc that a hero goes on, the emotional change, the obstacles that a hero must defeat in order to win or, get to the end of the book. And what drives change is conflict, because all of us, creatures of habit, will not change unless we're forced to. So,
no.
Yeah, and that is how you get the change, is through conflict. And what drives the conflict in a novel? That's your villain. So I always say that a villain is actually more important than the hero, because they are at the source of changing the hero, which is what the story is about, essentially. So the first thing I always think that's important is to get that straight in your head, and to value your villain as much as you value your hero. In terms of what makes a good villain, I think there's probably 4 or 5-ish things. So the first one is values. It's really, really important. Just like your hero will have values, they might, value strength or loyalty or doing good or whatever. It's also important that your villain has a value. And you can enact those in a couple of different ways. So you could have a positive value, like loyalty, that your villain enacts in a bad way. So, for example, Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter is an excellent example of this. Anybody who betrays his loyalty, they're going to die. So, that is an example of enacting a positive trait in a bad way. And then, of course, you could have a negative value, like revenge, for example. And just moving on from that, another really important factor in your villains is to have a positive trait. So, for example, if you have a villain who is just a homicidal maniac who just wants to end the world, it's not very believable, because apart from people who, might have genuine, having a complete psychopath as a villain in a crime book might be realistic, but that's usually because they're not really on the page very much. Excuse me. They tend to appear at the end, or if, some obviously might have a dual point of view, but for the most part, they're not on the page. I'm going to get back to the point. So having a positive trait creates a second layer of depth to the character. Most of us aren't inherently evil, and that goes for villains as well. They might have a warped sense of justice, or a warped sense of equality, or a warped sense of, what right and wrong is, but they don't believe they are bad. They believe they are doing the right thing. It's just that society or your hero doesn't. So having a positive trait is really important to make them believable. It gives them a sense of humanity, and you can enact that in a million different ways, be it showing kindness to somebody, or even if it's a henchman, having a pet is quite often one that happens. It could also be that you turn one of their negative traits into a positive temporarily. So that is a trick that I quite like to use. I'll try and whip through these. I appreciate I'm going on, but so another one.
No, that's fine.
So another one would be to have a really solid motive and a reason why. So this is often lacking, I find, in manuscripts that I do developmental edits on. They don't think through the why a villain is doing something. People, like, when we look at our psychology, we all do things for a reason. Our childhood, our teenage years, our most influential years shape our brain chemistry, like quite literally shapes our brain chemistry. And if you've had a wound in your past, often we talk about heroes and wounds and the thing that gives them their flaw. Well, your villain also has a wound in their past. And whilst you don't necessarily need to put it on the page because your villain isn't your protagonist, you do need to think about that because it will drive their behavior. Let's say they lost family in a boating accident. I'm just talking about this on the hoof now, but perhaps they then that would give them a wound, and they might then want to seek revenge on the boating company. But a hero might choose instead to enact that wound in a positive way. So they might start up a charity for people of drowning victims or whatever. So it's looking at how you can incorporate that wound and give your villain a reason for why he's behaving and in that particular way, and doing the bad things that he's doing. Last two, make them unbeatable. Too often we give our heroes an easy ride, and we don't make things difficult enough. So one way to stop that is to make a really unbeatable villain for like 85% of your novel. Make them an expert in something, make them better than the hero at something, because the harder it is for your hero to win, the more invested your readers will be. And last but by no means least, give them a really strong sense of integrity, which is actually a really positive trait to have. But I will tell you the reason why it's so important for a villain. When you have integrity, you do what you say you're going to do, even if it means doing something bad. And that makes a villain, particularly when they do bad things because they said they're going to do them, it makes them frightening. If they're like, if you don't do X, I will kidnap your child. And then they kidnap the child. That is terrifying and also makes them very believable. So those would be my top things.
Yeah. No, but I think that there's some really, really, really good points in there, and especially about the reason for being evil, because that's also something I always keep saying. Autumn and I are actually writing a book about creating characters and also plotting at the moment. And in the character section part of it, we are also saying in there that everybody is a hero of their own story, right? So the villain will also believe that what he's doing is for the greater good. So I fully agree with what you're saying, that you need a good reason for them doing what they're doing. And unfortunately, I've also seen, like in mainstream, what is he called? Bane, or what is he called? The adversary in one of the superhero things, where it was something to do with a doll or some stupid stuff like that, where it almost felt like they were making up a reason just to have one. And for him being evil, right? And that doesn't work.
No, absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah, I think maybe too many writers are also too concerned about the villain becoming, let's say, too likable, and therefore they make him just like super evil without any reason for being evil. But I would almost go the other way and say the more likable, or at least understandable, you can make the villain, the better the villain he will be.
Oh, absolutely. And you only have to look at the rise in popularity of anti-heroes to see how true that is. Villains, villains often, like, none of us would want to admit this, but sometimes they do the hard thing, they do the controversial thing, and sometimes there might be parts of us that agree with them, and that's particularly what anti-heroes do. They do the naughty things that we all wish we could do, but we can't, because stabbing your boss in the eye with a fork is technically illegal.
yeah, but that's absolutely true. But also, sometimes the villains are just, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but in Star Wars, for example, I like Vader the most. He's just so cool. But of course, he's not the good guy. but it is so. Sometimes it's just the villains who are really, really strong characters, and I think it's important to have strong villains.
Absolutely.
Because without it, as you say as well, then you have no real conflict and no driver behind, and then the story will suffer.
Exactly. I think the mark of a good story, well, there are many marks of good stories, but one of my most favored marks of a good story is a villain who will suck me in, and they'll make me like him, and then just as I'm about to tip over into, oh, I love this character, they'll go and do something so unbelievably terribly horrible that I'm like, oh, you kill me, because now I just can't like the villain or whatever. It's that roller coaster of emotions that I think comes from a good villain.
Yeah, absolutely. But do you think it's also important to show change in the villain, or do you just go with the villain is the same throughout?
No. So, there are lots of different types of villain arcs as well. I think what really interesting villains go on their own their own journey. So you can have a character who starts out nice. For example, this often happens in high school stories. You'll have two friends, and one will become I was going to say a naughty word there, but one will become a bitch essentially because she gets jealous, but she starts out nice, and then she declines on her own journey into becoming the I mean, to be honest, in that kind of story, it's more of an antagonist than a villain, but they will descend, and it's only as they descend that if you look at a graph, they are descending downwards. The hero starts to rise upwards, and it's at that point of crossing that the hero overcomes their flaw in order to defeat the villain, and the villain falls into that point of insanity where there's no return for them. But you also have other types of villains. So a redemption arc is, I just love a redemption arc. So a typical villain, obviously, as I've said, will go downwards. They'll start, maybe bad, but they'll decline rapidly into the dark pits of, I'm a push the red button of nuclear explosion. But a redemption arc is when they might start bad, but actually they end up doing the right thing, or they redeem themselves for whatever it is they've done. A good example of that, in relatively recent TV series was Once Upon a Time, I think it was. The evil queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, so she's called Regina in this TV show. She has a fantastic redemption arc over the 7 series. So I would highly recommend that TV series if you want to see a recent example of a redemption arc that I loved.
Cool. Yeah, but I think it is important to think about the villain as a character rather than just a mechanism to throw some stuff in the face of the hero all the time, right? Because there needs to be some depth to the villain as well. Of course, I do think sometimes when we're dealing with fantasy, if your villain is like the Dark Lord or something, like in Lord of the Rings or whatever, right? Then it can be a bit difficult to try to think about how do I show a real change in Sauron or something, right? I mean, but even, I mean, I think it applies both ways. This about as before we talked about not shoehorning in a reason for the villain to be evil, but at the same time, I think it applies the other way around as well. Sometimes don't shoehorn in a change because you think that's a good idea. It all depends on the story.
Absolutely, and we all know I'm a rebel, so you can break any writing rule that you want as long as you're creating believable characters and you have readers that like your stories. But I one of the things that I think is important, although again, lots of writers will break this and still create good stories, but allowing your villain, so your hero represents the theme in your book, okay? So your villain should I'll put my teeth back in, should represent the anti-theme. So a good example of this, again, I will go back to The Hunger Games. Hopefully everybody has seen or read The Hunger Games, but Katniss represents sacrifice. Even in the first chapter, her sister gets called to go into this really dangerous, life-threatening TV reality show, and she sacrifices herself in order to protect her sister. Everything she does in the novel is about sacrifice, and sacrificing herself for the greater good of others and in order to get what you want. But President Snow sacrifices other people for his benefit. So he is a direct reversal of the book's theme. And he will, yes, okay, one of his values is he'll only kill people for a purpose, but you can be damn sure that he will kill somebody if it's going to benefit him. So yeah, I really think that's another important aspect to make sure you look at in preparing your villain and hero.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So speaking of that, of what you just said there, how much and how much detail do you advise to go into character planning before you start writing? How much of this do you set up in advance, and how much do you sort of figure out along the way?
I think that is individual to each writer. I love talking about process and talking to other writers about what they do, about their plan or a pantser or writing into the dark, etc. But I don't think there is one right answer. At the end of the day, if you are finishing books, then the process works for you. If you're not finishing books, then try something else and experiment. Some people like to let their characters play out on the page and then they're happy to do revisions. That's fine. Some people like to go into a lot of depth planning before they start. I think even if you don't write it down and you don't plan it, knowing your villain's flaw and positive trait and their wound in the past is helpful before you start, because it can help you shape your scenes and the conversations, and it will enable you to know both what your hero needs to be bad and good at and how eventually they'll defeat them. But ultimately, I hate dictating to people how they should and shouldn't do their planning, because I just think there are as many different processes as there are writers out there, and you have to find an experiment to see what works for you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I think also that there is pros and cons to all of it. The more that you can plan out in advance, the more time you're going to save in editing. But if you feel like planning out in advance is killing your creativity, then maybe it's better to just spend more time editing. So each to his own.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, don't be afraid to change your mind. So I always sometimes forget that I have permission to change my mind and things. So if anybody's listening, you have permission to experiment. But yeah, so I have written books that are heavily planned and also not planned at all. And sometimes different books and different projects require different methods. So that's okay if you need to change up your method. You have permission.
Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of heroes versus villains here, are there any fundamental things that you think is really important for writers to be aware of in terms of differences between the two? We spent quite some time here at the moment talking about villains and how to make them great. You did also touch upon the heroes a bit in the beginning, but is there any fundamental things that are really important, or do you think the same sort of characteristics applies to both?
Kind of, but in opposite ways. So when we talked about a villain, we said that they need a positive trait in amongst their negative ones. But for a hero, they need a negative trait in amongst their positive ones. So nobody likes the perfect person. Nobody really likes the geek at school who always has their hand up and always get things right. It's annoying. It makes us feel bad, So
we feel stupid.
Screw you, clever person. Nobody likes a perfect hero because actually it's boring. There's no trials and tribulations, and it's unrelatable. One of the things that we readers love the most is to be able to relate to the hero, and in particular their emotional journey, because that really is at the heart of stories is the emotion. And we're not perfect as humans, and therefore your hero should not be perfect. They should make mistakes. They should say the wrong thing. They should upset people. Ultimately, though, they obviously need to be overwhelmingly good in order to be the hero, or not. If you have an anti-hero, obviously they are, a good 50-50 balance of good and evil. The other thing that I think is really important to concentrate with the hero is something that I talk about in my book, 10 Steps to Hero, How to Craft a Kick-Ass Protagonist. And that's the hero lens. So often, and it will depend slightly on the point of view that you're writing in, but broadly speaking, even if you're in an omniscient, looking over the heads of all of the characters type and point of view, your story will be told through the eyes of either a character, your protagonist, or another character, or through a series of different characters. And the important thing to remember is that is all your reader has. Okay, so for example, I might see turquoise as more greeny blue than bluey green, but other people might see it more as bluey green. So each of us has this unique way of looking at the world, and the hero lens is essentially a funnel through which your reader sees the story, and it is through the eyes of your hero. And the way that you can craft that lens is through actions, thoughts and feelings and dialogue. Now, if you're an example, so to put this into practice as an example, if you have a really stuffy, formal, pompous sort of academic as a character, you need to think how that personality would be reflected across dialogue, across thoughts, feelings, and action, because the way that academic would behave is very different to a gang member, for example. So instead of using, and you can get really granular with this, but this is how you create really good characterization and how you create the sensation of individuality and uniqueness for your hero that your reader will fall in love with. So let's go nitty gritty and look at sort of a sentence level thing. A academic might say, instead of saying, "I've thought over your offer," they could say, "I've been contemplating your offer." So instead of using a basic word like think or thinking, they might say contemplating or pondering. And they might say, "I've come to the conclusion that it must be a no," rather than saying, "I've been thinking about your offer and it's a no." You have to look at how you can take those personality traits and filter them down through thoughts, through dialogue. I mean, that was a dialogue example, but even in the description, somebody who is a angry character will use shorter, sharper sentences and shorter words, often things like onomatopoeia. So they might talk about the banging footsteps of a soldier, for example, whereas somebody who is much more thoughtful might use my brain's gone completely blank now, but you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what a character notices is also different depending on personality. So one type of person will notice something else in a room than another type of personality will. Absolutely. Right? I mean, some personalities will enter a room and the first thing they'll look for, okay, this is me. So when I enter a room, I'll look for, okay, so where's the toilets? Where are the exits? So I need to know where everything is, right? But somebody else might enter a room and think, oh, those look like interesting people over there. I better go over there and talk to them, right? And that's not me.
Definitely. And it those details that characterization comes from, and the reflection on how those things make them feel. So I think in the book there's an example about two different characters, a more depressed character and an angry character, looking at a parade, and the difference is it's the same event, but they're looking at it through very different eyes, and so they are noticing different details. And so it's one of my most favorite things to do in when I'm writing, is to think about the details that one character will see over another.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I was thinking about while you were saying that, and I don't know what your thoughts about this is, but the sentence level, for me, that sounds like something that you should probably spend most of your time on, let's say, correcting or updating when you're doing your editing. Because I think if you get bogged down in all of that during your first draft, you might spend quite a lot of time thinking about the right words that this character will use, and then at the end of the day you're going to edit some of it out anyway or whatnot. So I don't know what you think about that. Do you go about it right away, or do you sort of save some of those details for the editing stage?
I think it depends. Like I said earlier, some people will write an extremely clean first draft, and that's because they cycle through. So they might write a chapter, read a chapter, read and edit a chapter, write the next chapter, read it. At the end of the day, if you are finishing books, it doesn't matter how you're doing it. I tend to use a mixture. I'm a bit of a burst writer, but I'm changing that. I am trying to write consistently instead of, writing 20K in a week and then not writing for a week.
Right.
But for me personally, I do a bit of a mixture. Sometimes I will take forever to, write a single sentence, and then other times I will just vomit an entire scene out and I'll revise it later. And I think it just depends on how I'm feeling and what the moment calls for. But I definitely I wouldn't say I write flowery, but I definitely love description, and I love obsessing about the sentence level stuff. So I probably spend a reasonable amount of time doing that in revisions, or if I'm doing it at the time. But it depends on the project. It depends on the characters. Some characters are so fully formed when they appear on the page that you don't need to revise them because their voice is so crystal clear. Other characters take longer to develop. So, for example, one of my characters in my young adult fantasy novel has been there since book one. I'm now on book 3, but they were much blander, I think, in book 1, and by book 3 they're now this like total diva, and snarky genius diva, and so they've really come into their own, and perhaps I could have done more planning beforehand to ensure that this character was the same from the start, but I like it because I feel like this character has come into their own. So are you finishing books? That's the real important question. If you're finishing books, it doesn't matter how you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. But I was also thinking to ask you, maybe sort of as a rounding off, I don't know, but because we have so many streaming services nowadays, you have so many movies that is easily available to everybody. What do you think about taking inspiration from characters in it could also be in other books, but maybe from movies or TV shows or whatever, and using that as inspiration for your own characters? Do you think that's a good idea, or doesn't it matter?
Yeah, absolutely. Get any inspiration you can from anywhere, be it going and visiting museums, climbing into abandoned buildings. Not that I've done that. But, any which way you can. And I think we'd be naive to say that the stories that we read or the TV shows that we watch don't influence us. I don't think we can avoid that. Arguably, you could say that every romance story that has ever been written is a rip-off of Romeo and Juliet. As long as you're not doing a carbon copy of a character, which frankly I don't believe that you could, because each writer's
it's probably not even possible.
Each writer's voice is different. But if you are taking elements of a story, or elements of a world building, or elements of whatever, then, so what? Every vampire story ever all has vampires in it. Does that mean every race of vampires is the same? Does that mean they all become a vampire in the same way? No. I don't think there are unique stories, really. I think, with 8 million books or whatever it is on Amazon, I think it's very hard to have something that is truly original. So yeah, don't be afraid. Just don't write carbon copies of, because obviously then that is plagiarism and illegal.
Yeah, but I fully agree. I mean, unless you're actually sitting there and copying exactly the same thing, then I fully agree that it's not possible to copy. Not even a story. I mean, sometimes I come across writers who email me, or some of them I've also received some tweets once in a while where people are asking that, what about when I share my story ideas, then people would steal it. And I always keep saying the same thing, like, nobody can steal your idea. I mean, it doesn't matter that you're telling people. If Tolkien told somebody, this is what I'm thinking about, I want to write for Lord of the Rings, and you sat down and wrote the Lord of the Rings while he was doing it in parallel, the two stories would be completely different, even though you started out from the same idea.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, and I mean this with no disrespect to any creative, but nobody else cares. We all, as creatives, we all have our own ideas that we are deeply passionate about, and they are ours. And yes, there might be similarities in other stories, but nobody wants to write somebody else's story. They want to write their own story. So it is usually highly unlikely that somebody will steal your idea or whatever. Yes, they might take elements or parts of your story, but nobody can write like you. Nobody has your voice, because nobody grew up under the same circumstances. Nobody has the same lens. See what I did there? Hero lens. That you have. And therefore, they cannot possibly write the same story as you.
No, absolutely true. It's a ton of good advice here, Sascha. Is there anything that you have not mentioned that you feel is important for the listener to know as well?
Just keep writing and keep practicing. And one thing that I really like to do is write flash fiction. I think it's a really good... so flash fiction, for anybody that doesn't know, is a very, very micro short story. Could be anything from 2 lines of dialogue up to sort of 1,000-word character sketches. But if you're ever unsure about how a character would act or behave, I always like to put them in strange situations, or give them an emotion to feel or to react to, and just write a very short piece. And I think that helps and stops people from making mistakes in their manuscripts. And it is also, that's then free material that you can then give to your readers or whatever. So yeah, just experiment.
Cool. So where can people find more about you and what you do, Sascha, if they want to check stuff out?
Okay, super. So my name is obviously Sacha Black, but it's Sascha with a C, so Sacha. And my website is sashablack.co.uk. You can find out more about my books. I have a blog there. You can find out more about my podcast there. The podcast is on all podcasting app catchery jobbies, and it's called the Rebel Author Podcast. If you would like to view my books, I'm wide, so I am anywhere that you can buy a book. You can buy my books. And last but by no means least, I am on Twitter and Facebook and all of those things. But I'm most frequently on Instagram, which is at Sacha Black Author. And one last thing, I do have a Facebook group where we do weekly accountability posts. We do flash fiction writing Wednesday challenges, and it's just generally a really nice support group. And that is called 13 Steps to Evil. Doesn't sound nice, does it? But it is, I promise. We're a supportive group.
That's excellent. And if you send me some links, Sascha, then I'll add it to the show notes so people can find it straight through there as well. All right. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Sascha.
Thank you so much for having me.
So next Monday, Autumn will be back, and we're going to dive deep into the topic of how to find other authors to collaborate with.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWriting Fantasy Podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jesper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get awesome rewards and keep the AmWriting Fantasy Podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.